Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk with Tammy, brought to you by BKNI Resources. Now, just a little bit of introduction regarding the show. The show is an extension of the Women of Essence series, in which we will usually bring in inspiring women from all walks of life to come in and to do seminars, conduct workshops for underprivileged women. So, following that line, Let's Talk with Tammy would also bring in interesting personalities in which we will talk about relevant topics and in which I hope you will take home bite sized insights every fortnight. Now, I'm Tammy, your host, a scientist at heart, a lecturer by profession, and Miss Sari Malaysia 2019. And I'm always looking forward to learn from my guests, which I'm sure you all do too. So let's get started, shall we? So I'm bringing in our guest. Okay, so
Hello.
tonight, hello, we'll be talking about emotional abuse. I know it's a pretty heavy topic. However, it is of importance because most of the time it is harder to recognize because we don't have physical receipts and it's also harder to prove. And I'm really glad to have Miss Puveshini here this evening. Ms. Puveshini is a clinical psychologist and a HRDF certified trainer who is passionate about mental health. And she believes that mental health should be destigmatized and made available to the masses via awareness building efforts. Thank you so much, Puveshini, for being here on the
Thank
show.
you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's start with a very basic question.
Okay.
People always say the word emotional abuse, and then sometimes they say psychological abuse. So, are they the same thing?
Okay, to me, I would say that, it's used very like interchangeably most of
Mm,
the time, right?
mhm.
But to me, I think the driving motivation behind emotional and psychological abuse is very different. Like to me,
Okay.
at least, when I'm looking
Okay.
at it, because I feel psychological abuse is like the umbrella of
Mm,
the things that you could do, and
mm-hmm.
because it has this intention to actually manipulate and control and bring somebody under your control. So there's this intention to do that, and one
Mm-hmm.
tool that you can use is emotional abuse. So you emotionally abuse a person so you can
Okay.
psychologically control them. I hope that
Oh,
makes
okay.
sense. So
Right,
that's
right.
how I view it, because
Mm-hmm.
when I think about a psychological abuser, I watched this movie called Invisible Man. I hope
Mm.
it's I'm getting the name correctly, and
Yes,
or even
correct. I
Gone
watched the
Girl.
film as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even Gone Girl,
Yep.
right? So it's the way the abusers, the perpetrators. One movie, the perpetrator is a male. In the other
Yep.
movie, the perpetrator is a female.
Yes.
But the way they plan it out, the way they orchestrate the whole thing has a
Mm.
very psychological intent. So the intent to manipulate, the intent to abuse, the
Mm.
intent to control this person is very clear.
Mm.
And within that relationship, how they express it is by putting someone down or abusing. And in Invisible Man, there's also like a lot of physical
Mm.
abuse that was going on. So
Yep.
I see it that way. But of
Mm-hmm.
course, a lot of literature, a lot of research could also use it interchangeably. So I think it really depends on the context. And I think every research, when they set up the context for the article, there would be a premise where they would explain that. But from what I have
Okay.
seen and my
Mm-hmm.
work with clients and also survivors, this is
Mm-hmm.
what I see happening most of the time.
Okay. So you would
Yeah.
say that the psychological abuse is like an umbrella, and then emotional abuse comes under that.
Yeah.
So if you were say it that way, right? What other forms of abuse go under psychological abuse apart from emotional abuse?
I think psychological abuse, the many ways of doing it, right? So when you attack
Okay.
somebody's emotions, then it comes to
Mm-hmm.
the emotional abuse. So you call them, you make them scared, or you try to, body shame them, or call them
Mm.
ugly, or doing all these different things. That would
Mm.
come. That would be emotionally abusive, but it has
Okay.
the flavor of also being a manipulation. So if I did all of this, you will be
Mm.
hurt, you will be
Mm-hmm.
fearful, and therefore you won't leave me. So it's very like
Okay.
intertwined with each other
Very, very manipulative, and it's like much more on a deeper level, you would
on
say.
a deeper level. Yeah.
Mm.
And
Mm.
sometimes like on some literature, they also differentiate that in terms of like, some people who are very like quick to anger, quick-tempered, quick, and then they just respond, and it's very like they don't even think about it. They just respond, they just shout because that's their way of dealing with problems or dealing with interpersonal issues, right? So that could have an emotional abuse quotient to it, but we have to check whether the intent is to manipulate, or is that how they memang, you know, deal with people like that. It doesn't mean it's right. It's still emotionally abusive, but they might be very like bodoh about doing it, you know, like they're just
they are quite a bit dense and not really reflective of how it is going to affect the person when you lash out like that. It's not with a prior intent. If I do this, then she'll behave that way. I mean, basically there's no planning. It's just
there's no planning. It's just like a reaction, right? It's not right. It can also be emotionally abusive, and even if we do only that repetitively, that's also counted as abuse. It's an abusive situation to be in. Whereas the psychological abuser would be like gaslighting you, trying to make you doubt your own realities. They might do something and then say, no, I didn't do it. It's all in your head, you know, or make you believe something happened that didn't happen. So when you start questioning your reality, it's very difficult for you start doubting yourself. And if you start doubting yourself, then it's very hard to take other steps. Because you're constantly questioning, did this really happen? Am I making things up? And especially if the abuser is very charming and they have this persona for the outside world. So the outside world sees them in a different way. And then within four walls, this person becomes a totally different monster and starts acting in a certain way. So it's very difficult for you to prove this outside.
So I get. Yeah. So basically, there's two things here. One is you start to question your reality, right? And then second is another, which will go later, which is about how are we going to convince someone outside that you are currently being abused. So let's go to the first one, right? So it is going to be very difficult to recognize emotional abuse.
Yeah.
Because I think the first time, the second time, you would feel something. And then if it's someone close to you, you're going to start normalizing their behavior. You're going to rationalize their behavior because that's what good people do. And then you start making excuses for that person's behavior. So how do we recognize, okay, this is actually not okay. This is actually abuse already.
Okay. So I think before even recognizing that abuse that you're in currently, right, we have to take a step back and look at the culture that we are steeped in, right? So in this culture, we live in an atmosphere where we have, I think since young, we all have this idea that, you know, spare the rod and spoil the child, right? So the goal of that, the second part of that is basically to instill good values, to instill good morals, and to shape the child to become a useful and helpful, productive human being.
Yeah.
So the intent is good, but the approach used to get there is through abusive means.
Yes.
Right? It could be just a hit, it could be just a smack or whatever it is, but it's still abuse. And some parents, they might not hit, but they might shout, they might scream, they might control them through this kind of words, right? So when that happens, this child grow up, and I've seen so many clients who tell me, like, to motivate myself, I need to be harsh to myself. I need to tell myself, you stupid fat woman, get running. You know, so when you have that mentality, then you start normalizing when people start treating you that way, because it's very easy for the perpetrators to say, I'm doing this because I'm giving you tough love. Right? So it's masked under this idea of care. Like, I'm doing this because I care about you. I'm pushing you to be better than what you are. And I'm pushing you to be the best that you can be. But it's done in a very harsh way. It's done in a very, very abusive, emotionally abusive, demeaning way. Right? So because of that, it becomes very hard to recognize, because you start linking that up with, this is love, this is care. And within, I think culturally, they have a lot of like beliefs that, and I think if you come from the Indian culture, there's a lot of things that people have said to normalize abuse, all kinds of abuse. And there are some that would say, like, this is something that I've watched growing up, right, in movies. They would say, if the more, I don't know how you translate it, but the angrier a person is, the more hot-tempered the person is, that means they have much better values. They
Mm.
are a
Because they're
better
much more passionate, they're much more intense.
yeah. So when you translate that into relationships, you can see how easily a person who's like that, who's like, being emotionally abusive, can be seen as, oh no, but he's just angry, like, and
Mm.
people say things like this, or she's
Mm.
just angry and she's just upset and that's why she's
Mm.
saying like that. So it's very difficult. That's why it's very difficult to recognize it,
Mm.
right? But what we can do is to actually focus on yourself, because how you are reacting, like you mentioned, no, you start making excuses for that person. And if you're making excuses, that means people have recognized that.
Mm.
People have recognized that, and you're making excuses to defend them. So
Yeah.
if people start recognizing, and you notice that your people constantly ask you this, and you are constantly making excuses, and you feel fearful, you are scared to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, or there's no level of like on eggshells most of the time,
Mm.
because this person's going
Yeah.
to shout, this person's going to say this person's going to do
Mm.
that. Constantly feeling down about yourself,
Mm.
seeing that switch
Mm.
from how you were to how you are right now. So all
Yeah.
this are basically cues that you can use to
Mm.
actually recognize if it is happening. But
Mm.
it's not
I think
easy.
it is not easy, right? But because sometimes emotional abuse can be disguised as a joke or like
Mm,
a harmless sarcasm. But I think you brought up a very important point, that the moment you'd have to stop and reflect that, wait, I'm giving way too much excuses
mm,
to for himself or to myself to bear with this behavior.
yeah.
And I think that's when you need to realize that this is not good for you.
Mm, yeah. Yep.
Okay.
And also to see whether this is a pattern, right? To see that pattern happening. And
Mm,
sometimes there are people who are generally very sensitive to remarks, very sensitive
mm,
to statements, right? And not only with their partner or certain people, they are like that with everybody.
yeah.
So they kind of see from their worldview, everybody is abusing me. Everybody is being emotionally
Mm,
abusive. If that is the case, then we also need to reflect, why is this happening? Why is everybody treating me this way?
mm,
Right? So there's two. One is, I'm not saying that's not abuse, that you could be, just unlucky that you're meeting everybody who's abusing you, but you want to
yeah.
also see if there are other factors that's contributing. Is
Mm,
it that you see everything as an abuse, or is it
mm.
a real abuse?
All
And
right.
you can see that if every experience you have with everyone is abusive, then you want to also reflect on that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Which brings me to the third question. Do you think some people are more susceptible to become victims?
Yeah. Some people have higher risk factors of
Mm,
becoming victims, simply because they have been, the culture they come from, the background they come from, has normalized abuse,
mm,
right? And okay, so I can give you an example. A child who grows up in a house where they see their parents or grandparents to their parents, between parents and the siblings, just basically the whole dynamic. Everybody is very emotionally abusive, everyone's shouting, everyone is constantly in this state of you know uh, um, heightened emotional expressiveness, right?
yeah. Yeah.
And it's like not a very safe environment, but because they
Mm,
are used to that, they assume that this is how families are, this is how you talk to people, this is how you
mm,
should be. And so
mm,
when they meet people who are not like that, they feel something is off, because they're so used to that
mm.
sort of a relationship, because this is family. And if family means protection, family means love, then this must mean love.
Love as
So
well.
when, so when someone doesn't act that way, they feel this is
Mm,
not love. We are not having that same level of
mm,
connectivity, or that bonding that
mm,
I'm used to. So they might seek out people who would reciprocate that.
mm,
So that's like, we call it like trauma bonding, like, because
mm. Yeah.
they are bonded. They believe that this is the kind of attachment
Yeah.
that's right, or that's good, right? And so
Mm,
that's the reality they know. So it makes them at higher risk to seek out
okay.
relationships like this. And then also the kind of communities you come from, when you normalize these things, right? You
Mm,
normalize these things and you say that's normal, that's how everyone is. So you believe that that's how things are, and that's the people that you meet. Let's say you
Mm,
come from a very violent background, violent
mm,
community. Those are the kind of people that you meet, and you think that this is normal, right? So the higher
yep.
chances of you dating somebody from there or having relationships with people from that
That mimics the
that
dynamics
mimics that dynamic. Yeah.
that you've brought up in.
Yes.
Okay. So earlier, while we were talking about this, it's always been, how we talk about people who are yelling at you and, those kind of things, which is quite obvious. I mean, obviously, we don't like to be yelled at, we don't like to be insulted, we don't like to be
Mm-hmm.
humiliated. But there's also the covert side
Yeah.
of emotional
Yeah.
abuse.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a bit on that?
So, like, whatever we spoke about is like overtly, like obviously, attacking you. But
Mm,
then there are other areas that's very masked, like acting like they're jealous or possessive of you and saying that,
mm,
oh, I'm doing this because I love you. I want you all to myself and
mm,
I don't want to share you with anybody. So when you do this, then it creates a kind of pressure. Like you have to cut off your social relationships. You can't meet people you want to meet. So that's
mm,
also like, it's not directly abusive, but it's playing on your emotions. Or
mm-hmm,
some people might say, oh, if you leave me, I will commit suicide.
mm,
Or if you're married, then, oh, if you do this, then I would harm the kids. I
mm,
might do something to them. I might break whatever, or breaking things that belong to you,
mm,
but they're not directly affecting you, but they're doing this to control. They're doing this to kind of because they know that will affect you,
yep.
right? So it's very like monitoring your activities,
Mm,
seeing where you're going, telling you what to wear. So it's not
mm,
directly telling you that you're ugly or whatever, but saying, oh no, I think you should wear this, dress up this way, dress up that way.
mm,
And if you don't, then when they become angry and then they harm themselves, then you get affected by
yep.
it as well. So all
Yeah.
these things can also be very, very emotionally manipulating.
Mm.
And it can be
What I was,
very, yes,
yeah, continue.
yeah, it can be very emotionally abusive when you
Mm,
have to go through this in a long
mm,
run. Like imagine living your life like that, not being
mm,
able to do what you want to do, or live your life because you are an independent adult, right?
yep.
And for somebody to control your behaviors to that extent and
Mm,
make like the sense of codependency, like like whatever you do seems to be affecting them, whatever they do seems like they believe that's how you should be,
mm,
then it's not a very healthy relationship.
mm. I think we can see based on the example that you gave how easy it is, how what a slippery slope it is as well.
Mm.
Because in the beginning, it could seem to be a very innocent advice or an innocent comment,
Yeah.
and then by the time you realize that this is actually not okay, you are quite lost
Deep
already.
in. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
And sometimes it can be very like I think you mentioned it when you're promoting this talk, like very insidious, right? When they
Yes.
tell you things like, oh, you're very lucky to be with me,
Mm,
things like that, or you will never
mm,
find someone who's better than me, or
mm,
it can be very like offhand remarks,
mhm,
but it
mhm.
has a lot of implication because it's basically telling you that
It's
you
like
are worthless.
subconsciously instilling
Yeah,
something. Yeah. It's
yeah,
like a calculated move to basically do this. Like, okay, you
yeah,
know what? You're not going to get anyone better than me. You might as well just bear with it
yeah,
and put up with this.
yeah, yes.
Okay. So when it comes to um, drawing the line, because most of
Mm,
the time, even when we go out and let's say we tell someone, okay, this person is abusive, the first question they ask would be, did that person hit you?
mm,
Because like for them, that is like, oh, that is abuse,
mm, mm,
right?
mm.
And even when you want to try to explain to someone, because you told earlier, usually abusers, they have a totally different facade outside where nobody's going to believe you the moment you tell outside, okay, you know what,
Mm,
this person has been doing this. And the process is so slow,
mm.
right? The emotional abuse and everything is so slow because, and if you were to just tell one instance to a third person, it's not going to sound like a serious
Yeah,
thing at
yeah.
all,
Mm,
right? So how are we going to, and when you tell someone and you don't get the validation from someone else that this is wrong, this is something is wrong here,
Mm.
how are we going to convince ourselves then that there's something is really wrong?
Okay, I think so. Let's go to the how to convince others later, right?
Mm,
But
mm,
first of all, you need to be convinced that this is abuse, and I think
yes.
that's the biggest step most of the time,
Mm,
because I feel like once you are convinced this is not right, then
mm,
you will somehow or other find help. Like
right.
maybe people in your immediate circle don't agree,
Mm,
but online there's so many groups that support, and
mm,
peer-based groups that are there for you to go and seek help,
yeah.
like-minded people, right?
Mm,
And so, but before that, you need to first recognize that this is abuse,
mm,
right? And how you recognize abuse is one-off remarks and all of that. It's going to be like, if you stand up to it, you can see where their values lie. So when you
mm,
stand up to somebody and you're talking to them, the goal is to save the relationship, to protect
yeah.
yourself and save the relationship. So you're talking
Mhm,
to them and you're saying that I didn't like it when you said this remark and all that. So in a
mm,
healthy relationship, essentially the other person would recognize that I'm so sorry, I didn't know that it hurt you. I
mm,
won't do it again.
mm,
So that is like a healthy dynamic, right? I mean,
mm,
it's very
mm.
reductionist, but for the sake of
But
discussion,
essentially, that's how it's
yeah,
supposed to be because you
essentially that's
wouldn't
how
want
it
to hurt someone that you
yeah,
love,
yeah,
right?
right.
Mm,
So, but when you're talking to a person who's intentionally abusing you or very emotionally abusive, they would turn it around, either denying it or making it a blame game, or saying that, oh, you did that and I did this and all this. It kind of gets out of hand. And sometimes it becomes like they start escalating. It start escalating because you've called them out on their behavior.
mm,
Right. So, and a few times that happens, eventually you start realizing you are scared
yeah.
to say something. You're scared
Mm.
to trigger them. So you just start being like, okay, lah, never mind. It's okay. It's not a big deal. It's
Mm.
okay. It's not a big deal. So when you
But that is
start,
corroding you inside.
yeah. So when you
Yeah.
start doing this, and you have, I think that the level of self-awareness has to be there. Like, to be
Mm.
aware that, hey, you know what? I'm feeling scared. I'm feeling insecure. I'm
Mhm.
feeling threatened in the
Mhm.
presence of this person. I'm feeling humiliated. And I
Yep.
think to listen to your body, your heart, and sometimes even your gut, because
Yes.
your body is like the best alarm system there is, because we
Mm.
are designed, I think, what do you call that, we are designed in a way that we can always tell when there's danger,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
That
Our fight or flight response will be
fight or
like,
flight
yeah.
response be very like on point
Mm.
whenever there's danger. So if you
Yep.
notice your fight or flight response, which is your stress response, is always heightened, it's very hyper
Mm.
vigilant around this particular person, then
Mm.
that's a really big cue. You're just listening to your body that this is
Mm.
something is not right, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
that can actually give you a signal to, what, you have to really start looking at what's going on here. It
Mm.
might not even be abusive. I'm not saying that all the time your stress signal is going off, it's
Yeah.
abusive, but
Correct.
it's something for you to pay attention to. There's something going on here. And
Mm.
because it's not normal behavior to put someone else down. So no
Yeah.
matter what anyone tells you, oh, it's okay, it's just a joke, it's just a harmless thing,
Mm.
it's
Mhm.
not okay. Because
Yep.
calling somebody, humiliating somebody, calling someone names, yelling at somebody, all of this is really abusive behavior. So if someone is telling you this is normal behavior,
Mhm.
then maybe you should stop talking to that person.
Yeah.
Right? So to
Yeah.
educate yourself as
Mhm.
well
Mhm.
on what is normal behavior, what's healthy relationships. And I
Mm.
feel that is a realization that a lot of us don't have. Like,
Yeah.
what is healthy in a relationship? We just know, oh, love, and let's get in relationships, and let's just live our lives. But nobody
Yeah.
actually knows the how do I deal with conflicts? How do I
Correct.
manage it? How do I not escalate things?
Mm.
Nobody learns about that. So I think
Yeah.
that is something that's very worthwhile for people to actually pay attention to.
Okay, this just popped out in my head because it's so funny when you say that because a lot of people don't know what it means to be in a healthy relationship, and that's true. And especially we use the word compromise a lot. Again, we
Mm,
don't know where to draw the line when it comes to compromising,
yeah.
right? And do you think, okay, this is just a random question that came out, right? Do you think, I know for Muslims, we have this kursus before they get
Mm.
married, right?
Even
Do you,
Christians have.
as a psychologist, right, don't you do you think that we should have that for everyone before people get married,
Yes. I think we
right?
should have that when people get married. We should have that when people become parents. And we
Yes.
should have that when parents are graduating from different stages. Like
Mm,
how to parent a child is different from how you parent a teenager. And how you parent a
mm,
teenager is different from how you be parents to adults. Right? So these are basic life skills that are really, really important.
yeah,
And I think
yeah.
currently only Muslims have it, and also Christians, I think they have it. But
Okay.
how in depth, how focused is it? I'm not sure because
Mm,
I've never been to any of it.
mhm,
But if it's, I don't know the efficacy of it. But what I'm thinking is if there was a national level training that people had to go through to learn these skills, like how do
mm,
you recognize abuse, how do you not abuse, how do you protect yourself from, how to
yeah,
basically build healthy relationships. Because if you learn that, then all these others, you don't
yeah,
need to have so many, like how not to abuse, because you learn how to be a proper person, right? And it has
correct.
to start even way before in school, because in
Yeah,
school you're not taught all this. You're
yes.
just, you focus more on the external world, but nobody really focuses on your internal world. Like
Mm,
how do you deal with your emotions, how do you
yeah,
recognize your emotions, how do you accept your emotions. So you
yeah,
get
that's
people,
true.
and we put people down for talking about their emotions. So when people are
Mhm,
abused and they're saying that I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling down and all, and you're like brushing it off, like no, 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 don't focus on that, that's not
mm,
important, let's just um, focus on life. But what
yeah,
is this life when you are being
yeah,
abused,
that's
right?
true.
So
Yeah.
that is something that's definitely very, very important for us.
Mm. So you said earlier about how even before going out to a third person, the first step comes from the realization from yourself that there's something is not right, to trust
Yeah.
your gut instincts, right? And yes, I understand that when you open internet, you see a lot of support groups and things like that. But some people sometimes, oh, you know the whole going down the rabbit hole, right? When you go to the internet or when you open WebMD and you see the symptoms, and sometimes you feel like, oh my God, all the
Yeah.
symptoms, I'm showing all those symptoms. So it's very difficult to navigate through or to relate your personal experiences to the support groups or to a random psychological
Mm,
article.
mm,
So they
mm,
would tend to go to their closest relatives or to their friends,
mm,
right? And following that, Jane actually has a question in relation to that. So I'm going to show you the question. Right. So when emotional abuse is so intangible and momentary sometimes,
mm.
right? How do victims get help and speak about it without feeling like they are being dramatic or overly sensitive?
Okay, so this term, right? Like you're being dramatic, you're being
Mm,
overly sensitive. It's
mm,
so freely used to,
yes.
to just describe any emotional feeling. Because what
Mm,
is dramatic to you might not be dramatic to me. What is being overly sensitive? Because how sensitive one person is differs from the other person. So I
mm-hmm,
think it comes back to, as long as you are feeling bad about it, maybe it's something that you can start talking to somebody else, and talk to somebody who is in a place where they are informed enough to help you. Because if
mm,
you're talking to somebody else who's just in that same environment, and that same, that they also don't know, and they're just giving you the layman kind of advice.
mm. Or they
They
might grow up with the same values
Yeah,
as you.
as
Mm.
you. So they would tell you like, oh, you're just being dramatic. You're being, because they are not being
Empathetic,
neutral.
empathetic, right?
Empathetic is one thing, but they're not able to be neutral.
Mm, mm,
So
mm.
obviously, if you already have this relationship with this person, and there's baggage there, and all of us have it with anybody that we come into contact with, our close circles, right?
Mm,
So they will tend to look at whatever you're saying from a different lens. So they're
mm,
not seeing it as a neutral observer and seeing how this particular comment might have hurt you, right? They'll be seeing like, oh, you're always like that. Remember that time when this happened and that happened, and So you want to ideally get somebody to talk to somebody who is able to be empathetic and who's able to be that neutral person who can hear you out, see if there are patterns of this, and see what you can do about it and help you through that process. So sometimes even to understand whether you're being abusive, you might need like a professional to guide you through it, right? So if that's an option that's available to you, then by all means take that and speak to somebody if you're
Okay.
confused.
Yeah. Okay. So all this while we're discussing, I think a lot of it had somehow had the romantic relationship in the background as we are discussing, right? But emotional abuse does not just happen in romantic relationship,
Yeah.
right? There are child emotional abuse, there's elder emotional abuse, there's even workplace emotional abuse. Could you care to just describe a little bit about each? But I think child is a bit how to say, quite we kind of know about it, similar to romantic relationship, but I think it'd be better if you were to explain it a bit as well.
Okay, so I think when you think about any type of emotional abuse, right, the context that it happens is different. So it happens in context of romantic relationship. It can happen in context of other domestic relationships, right? So not only romantic, but parent to child, siblings, any form and manner, it can happen. And I think that the underlying theme among all this, whether it's any type of relationships you have, whether it's child, elder, workplace, it's that this attempt to exert power and control the other person, the person that you think is weaker than you, via emotional abuse. So when you think of it, it starts when you're a child, right? You get abused by your parents because your parents think that's the right way of raising a child, shouting and screaming and yelling and manipulating you and saying, if you love me, you would do this.
Yep.
Like some parents would say things like this. If you love me, then you would act in certain way.
And they also don't show love as a form
Yeah.
of punishment.
Yeah. They don't show love. They withhold love because you're not good enough for my love. Right. So it's not condition. It's very conditional love that's being
Yes,
shown.
correct.
So this person grows up and starts internalizing that and basically emulating that in their romantic relationships, right? Because it's a justification of I'm acting this way because you are making me act this way. So it's not I'm acting this way because I'm rotten. No, it's you are doing something to trigger me, and therefore I am yelling at you.
Victim blaming.
Yeah, victim blaming, right? So when they do that, they don't take responsibility, accountability for what they are doing. So when that as a child, when you're exposed to that, it carries over to your relationships with whoever it is. So it's always that I need to control you before you control me, because that's what they've been exposed to. And then when it comes to elder abuse, it's more like the younger people abusing. The younger people have more power in a sense.
Right. So it's basically exertion of power when there's like an imbalance in power dynamics.
Yeah. So the imbalance of power dynamics then is it's what do you call that? It's exhibited as emotional abuse when you are upset with them, especially with elders. They are losing functionality like bit by bit.
They're becoming more frail. They are not physically
frail.
strong.
They can't remember stuff. And they're losing the ability to take care of themselves. So they are in a more vulnerable position. And then because you come up with this mindset that other people are the cause of me being angry, other people are doing this, then you see that as them inconveniencing you, and then you shout at them, you abuse them, you show your frustrations towards them in a very abusive manner. So it all comes down to that. Even like able-bodied people abusing disabled-bodied people, right? Because you see them as an inconvenience, or you see them as troubling or whatever, and you there's no regulation of your own emotion, that you kind of like spew this out on somebody else. And when it happens like over time, especially if this person is dependent on you, then it becomes really, really you're stuck in that abusive cycle.
Yeah.
Because there's no escape. Like if you're an elder, you're a child.
Yeah.
At least if it's workplace, you can still escape. You can resign if that's an option. But for the other scenarios, because you're really dependent on this person, it intensifies the impact of the abuse.
Okay. It's also scary, isn't it? I mean, one thing is to have the whole psyche of an abuser, but when you have a power imbalance, even normal people who well-meaning people unintentionally become unkind
Yeah,
sometimes,
yeah,
right?
yes,
Okay.
yeah,
So the difference is only to realize that, oh shit, I hurt that person, and
mm,
what you do after realizing that you have hurt
yeah,
that person is what makes the
yeah,
difference between an
yes.
abuser and a nice person.
Yeah. And
Mm.
also, like, you want to also differentiate them from the cycle, right?
Mm.
This was actually designed for battered women, like was a battered women, the cycle of
Mhm.
abuse, right?
Cycle of
But I
abuse.
think it can also apply to many different relationships where if you find yourself, of course, like what you mentioned, like a one-off thing, like people, we all do that. We all
Yeah.
sometimes are unkind and we say things, but we don't mean to abuse them.
Yes.
Especially now with people being more woke and being more politically correct, we are very mindful of that. So we try not
Yes.
to do that.
Yeah.
And sometimes it might come off, like might not be intentional, but might come off as being, harsh. But
Mm.
what you do, like whether you apologize and whether you don't repeat that again.
Mm.
Sometimes people might apologize and then they do the same thing over and
Yes.
over. Then they apologize and they do the same thing over. So that's a cycle of abuse. So
Mm.
sometimes when you're stuck in that cycle, and it's very apparent with domestic relationships because they are constantly in that space together, right?
Mm.
So you will have the abuse, like they shout or yell or do whatever, and then there's a honeymoon period where they will say sorry and try to
Mm. Love
amend their
bombing. Mm.
and doing all of that, and then the stress starts building up and then they explode again.
Mm.
So that can happen, but for domestic, for physical abuse is very clear that happens. But for emotional abuse, psychological abuse, because it's very ongoing, it's an
Yes.
ongoing thing, which sometimes if you blink you just might miss it, and
Yes.
next thing you know you are deep in, like 5 children deep, and you don't even realize that this has been happening
Yeah. It's like
to
your
you.
new reality already. Like, you
Yeah,
can't. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So basically, you can put it back to power imbalance, and most of the time, it happens in a domestic setting. It could be between siblings, between parents and children, between romantic partners. But when it comes to workplace, right? There's this whole thing, emotional abuse. There's bullying. That's one thing. When you have one staff who is, who has just got it dirty on you, and just don't like you and have all these bad intentions.
Mm,
And there's also mobbing.
mm. When
How
everybody
Yeah. So how do you think, as someone who's going through that, could navigate through this thing?
So I would say that to first recognize that that's happening to you,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
and to see how you can protect yourself in that situation. Is there avenues for you to protect yourself? Is there regulations? Is there any step by step that you can do, right, to get out of this?
Mm-hmm.
But if there's no other place, especially in workplace, sometimes the you need to kind of like evaluate, like whether is it costing me more to stay in this job, or would it cost me more to leave,
Mm.
right? So if it will cost you more to leave and you can't leave, leaving is not an option, then maybe building yourself to be able to withstand this in a way.
Okay. Mm.
If there's no way out,
Mm.
you can't report, then how can you build your internal resources to protect yourself while this is happening
Right.
to you, right?
Okay.
So that's also one option that we can look at. So
Mm.
when people are saying things about you, people are calling you names or whatever, it is very painful. It is supposed to be painful, that's why they're
Yeah.
doing it, right?
Yeah.
But if there are skills, like in with my clients, right, we build skills on how to kind of like diffuse from that, from
Mm.
instead of listening to it, receiving it and internalizing it, how do I deflect,
Okay.
right? So those are skills that you can learn
Mm.
and apply if that's what's needed. But of course, it's not something that you can do on a prolonged basis, because
Yeah.
it's not
Correct.
healthy for you as well.
Yeah.
So then perhaps what would be more helpful is to actually get another healthier
Working
workplace,
environment. Mm.
working environment. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So when it comes to, I think, oh wow, because when I look at this question, I think it's kind of like half answering uh, my my question right now, because we're talking about power imbalance, because that's like the crux or like the main
Mm,
reason
mm,
for
mm,
abuse. But I want to talk about the double standards that we
mm,
have in perceiving male victims and female victims. Now, we can't deny the fact that there are more female victims because, again, the power imbalance. Men are much
mm.
more physically stronger. So, it
Yeah.
always leads to physical abuse and all those things. But we
Mm,
can't deny the fact that women are abusers as well. There's
mm.
no difference, right?
Yeah.
And the only reason we could see there are smaller percentage of male victims could be because it is underreported. Men are not coming forward to say because they don't get enough support.
Mm.
So, what do you have to say about this?
I think like for women, right? It's while we recognize that women get abused more, the recognition is there. But even when it's actually happening, like when you are in a situation where you see somebody come and talk to you, oftentimes these female victims are always victim blamed. Like it's always something you did that caused it. You shouldn't
Mm,
have said this. You shouldn't have said that. So that's their reality, what they have to go through.
mm,
And some studies have actually shown when it comes to men, out of the men that this particular study that they interviewed, only
mm-hmm.
a third of them actually saw what was going on to them with them as domestic abuse or as
Wow.
being emotionally abused, right? Because they
Okay.
didn't even recognize that as being a form of abuse.
Right.
um, and also there's a lot of like when they come and tell someone, when male survivors actually share their experience, whether they're being raped by a woman or whether they're being abused by a woman, people often see that as something to be laughed at.
Mm,
People feel like it's actually an attack against their masculinity. It's an attack against their sexuality. Like, what kind of man are you? Why would you complain if a woman is throwing herself on
mm,
you? So it's a very unfair way of looking at them, and it kind of
mm-hmm,
objectifies them
mm,
as well. So when men keep getting this form of responses, it kind of like then minimizes the chances that they would come out and talk
yep,
about it. So they
yep,
might not. And I think more than the sexes, right? Instead of looking at the sexes as whether male or female survivors,
mm-hmm,
I think it's helpful to look at the gender and how society has gendered us. Like all of us are gendered a certain way, right?
yep,
And I feel like feminine qualities are always equated to women, but actually
yep,
within all of us are feminine qualities and
yep,
masculine qualities.
true.
And just through cultural context, historical context, masculine qualities are seen as stronger, they're seen as more superior, they're seen as
Mm,
more better to have, right?
yep,
Compared to feminine qualities like empathy or nurturing or
mm,
being kind, and all of that are seen as female qualities. So a lot of times when people are abused, whether it's male or female,
yeah,
the people who become the survivors of abuse have more feminine qualities. So that's
mm,
not to say that they're just generally softer in spirit,
mm-hmm,
right? And which makes them more susceptible to being abused by this person who has who has more masculine traits. So that
mm.
person who has these masculine traits could be a
Could be a
man,
woman,
could be a woman as well.
right?
And
Yep,
you see that even in workplace, harassment.
mm,
Men also do get harassed, and usually it's the men who have more feminine qualities, right? So, and that is something. So I'm not even talking about people who are transgendered, right? And they definitely get a big brunt of it.
yep,
But
yep.
even men who are heterosexual, but they are softer, like they're not the very macho men.
They're not very alpha. They're not. Yeah.
They're not
Mm,
very alpha. They are
mm,
just like just peace loving, carefree kind of men. And there are many people like that. They
mm,
are more prone to getting physically abused.
mm,
It's still very gender based, and of course there are a lot more research that needs to be done on that. And something
mm-hmm,
that is my personal pet peeve is that male survivors are definitely largely invisible. We don't even talk about that as
yeah,
much, right?
yeah,
And so were female survivors. Nobody spoke about female abuse, or especially in the context of relationships and
yeah,
emotional abuse. Even physical abuse, it took a long time for people to recognize that in Malaysia, at least,
yeah. Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
And so you can forget about emotional abuse. Doesn't even make the cut. they are like, people have bigger physical abuse. Okay, we can recognize it. Emotional abuse, you're just being whiny, right?
Yep.
So even for women, emotional abuse is very difficult to establish, very difficult to prove, because they already stamped women as being emotional. So whatever you
Mm,
complain, it's going to be like, oh, you're just being, crybaby,
mm,
you're just, whatever.
that's
So,
true.
and it was not until the feminist movements and all started talking about it, pushing for, laws against it, fighting for people to take notice,
Mm-hmm.
when people started taking notice of abuse against women. So the same way, people who are passionate about abuse against men need to speak up. It cannot
Mm,
be something that you only think about when someone is talking about women abuse,
mm.
because that is something that happens a lot,
A lot of
right?
the time, yes.
A lot of the time, people, it's almost like me saying I want to conserve nature, and someone comes and says like, oh, diesel, child abuse is happening. Why aren't you fighting for that? Because there's definitely a lot of cost. Not like one is more important than the other,
That is
but
true.
you cannot take away light from an equally important topic just to
Mm,
shine light on something else. I think that
mm,
needs to stand alone,
mm,
because the factors that go into male abuse, why it happens, what can be done, how the survivors experience that, and perpetrators can also be men and women, like
yeah.
in heterosexual relationships, gay relationships, lesbian, the LGBTQ community, the
Mm,
relationships there, the abuses that happens there. So there's a
mm,
lot more research that needs to be done, and all of these are standalone causes. So it cannot ride or piggyback on some other cause
mm-hmm.
just because it's fun to do so. Like everybody will come and be like, oh, men get abused as well, but they only remember that when someone is talking about women getting abused. So I think that's
Yeah,
really unfair to both the causes.
that is very true. Very true. And when speaking about abuse, do you think you can basically talk about the general red flags of an abuser, or is it too difficult, especially for emotional abuse?
I think, I mean, like from what we discussed, right? The red
Mm-hmm.
flags, the very important red flags to recognize, and instead of recognizing the abuser, is to recognize the abuse, because that you will feel it, right? So
Yeah.
that's like your first stepping stone.
Oh, that's a
And
very good point to bring up. We
yeah,
always look at the front, but we don't sit
yeah,
and reflect like, wait, that person did not make me feel good.
yeah,
That should be
yeah.
your first red flag.
Yes, that should be
Mm.
your first red flag, and we always demean ourselves. So that's also
Yes.
another thing. We don't we don't respect ourselves as much as we respect other people. That's also
Mm-hmm.
something that
Yep.
we need to be aware of.
Yep.
So notice what's happening within you when
Mm.
you come in contact with this person. Also, when you're getting to know somebody, listen to their life story, like their families. So when they tell you stuff about their families, right? How they, whether they justify abuse happening in their family, or how they talk about it, all of it, or even movies, or when you're talking about random stuff, right? How they justify certain things, how they
Mm.
can give you a very good idea about how they view things. So
Mm.
I'm not saying that's like the be all and end all of, like, oh,
Yeah.
now they said this, so that means you definitely cut this person off. But
Mhm.
these are just like red flags for you to take notice of, that might be very like telltale signs that can help
Mm.
you see whether this person has the capacity to
Mhm.
emotionally abuse. How they
Mm.
treat people who are of lesser power structure. So if you're in the restaurant, how
Mm.
they talk to the waiters,
Mm.
how they treat people, how they deal with conflict, whether it's with you or with other people, how they talk about the conflict after
Mm.
that. All of these things are things that you need to be very aware of, because a lot of time people feel like when they treat a waiter badly, they're like, oh, that's just a waiter, it's fine, they won't do that to me.
Mm.
Or when they're talking about conflicts with somebody else, and you see there's something weird with the way they just viewed the
Describe
whole
the
thing.
person or describe the
Yeah.
situation.
So we tend to make excuses. So when you're making
Mm.
excuses, that's also another sign, because
Mm.
you won't need to make excuses if there's nothing wrong,
Correct.
right? So these
Mm.
are, and then whether you are putting in more effort than is
Mm.
needed. Because some people will say relationship is effort. Yes, it is effort.
But you
But
shouldn't be carrying the whole relationship.
yeah, you cannot be carrying the burden of the relationship, because if I did this, then this person will be angry, and then you are carrying the burden of the relationship, the burden of the other person's emotions, how they will react, and you are trying to
Navigate
think
so
about
many
all of
things.
it and navigate
Yes.
all of the things, which is really not healthy in the long run for you.
Mm, mm,
Yeah, so these are the things that you can start recognizing. And also, one very important thing is, if you recognize that, and this is something that I personally see with survivors or with clients that I work with, when you recognize that you have a low self-esteem and you can observe that,
mhm,
that is also can be a sign. Because sometimes when you value yourself very in a very low
mm.
way, it's very easy for somebody else to take advantage of that. And you won't even see that happening, because you think that, oh, I deserve this.
Mm,
So that's also something that if you realize that you have low self-esteem, then I would definitely tell people to work on that before
mm,
getting into a relationship, before doing anything else. Because when you start learning about yourself, you start appreciating yourself, you learn where to draw the lines.
mm.
You instinctively know where to draw it. So even if you find yourself in an emotionally abusive relationship, you eventually realize that, hey, this is not what I deserve.
Yeah.
So that can also be helpful to you.
That's a very sound advice.
Yeah.
So, if um, is there any avenues for victims here? Because usually it's domestic abuse. So if let's say there's emotional abuse when it comes to, I think because when it comes to other kind of things, when it comes to in domestic setting, I have a question. So if it's domestic setting, as long as it's within under the same roof, it doesn't have to be a partnership, right? It doesn't have to be husband wife, right? It could be parents and
No.
children and whatnot, right?
Yeah. It could be
Okay.
the
So
law applies to everybody.
right.
Even ex partners, ex relationship, like ex
Mm.
wife, ex husband. So it applies to them as well.
Okay. So let's say it is still at the emotional abuse stage because sometimes it could escalate to a physical abuse. Is there anywhere where victims can come forward and to complain?
Yeah. So you can, even if it's emotional abuse, right? You can, if you want that safety, because we don't know how it will escalate, right? So if you want to
Mm,
have a report just for safety purposes, like this has happened and all of that, you can go to the police and make a report. So when you make a
mm,
report at the police station, you either make a cover report. So a cover report means they don't take action,
mm.
but it's just there as
It's a
documentation that
record
this
purposes,
as
yeah,
a record
that this has
purpose.
happened before.
Yeah. Yes. And the other one is you can ask them to take action. So of course, a lot of times people won't go for emotional abuse. They don't,
Yes,
depending on the severity of it, they wouldn't go. So then the
yeah.
other things you can do is find help for yourself.
Mm,
So you can go to like places like Women's Aid Organization, you can go to Women's Center for Change, Awam, all these places that are set up to actually help people, survivors of even emotion, any type of abuse, right?
mm, mhm.
To help them to kind of process what's happening and try to see whether this is what they want to do, what they can do, and how to help them for how to take care of themselves. And also people like psychologists or counselors or social workers, they're all there to provide this kind of support
Mhm,
for survivors who go through emotional abuse. So you can reach out to them. Befrienders is another resource. So
mhm,
although Befrienders is a suicide prevention line, but they have
mhm.
counselors who are manning or womaning the phone. So you can
Right.
just call them and talk. It doesn't need to
Okay.
only be about suicide. It can be about this kind of stuff as well,
Okay.
where
I
you
think
are
that's
feeling
a good thing. I don't think many people knew about that because the moment
yeah,
they think about befrienders, it's only about suicide prevention.
yeah.
Mm.
Yep. So of course I mean, of course, because they are mainly set for suicide prevention, you don't want to flood their lines as well.
Yes, of course.
But if there is a need and you don't know where to turn to, I'm sure that's also an avenue for you, right? And
Okay.
also mental health. And I think we need to really, really normalize mental health in Malaysia, because
Mhm.
a lot of times people look at seeing a therapist as something like taboo. That means something is wrong with me.
Yeah.
But seeing a therapist could also be for support, for processing, for giving a different perspective of looking at life events like this, right? So you might not have a mental health issue,
Mhm.
but to get that support, like to learn skills to manage, to protect yourself, to build your self-esteem, to build your resiliency as a person who's gone through emotional abuse. So all of this, there are help there, but it depends whether you want to access that, and whether
Correct.
you have the, if you don't have the privilege of assessing it, then of course there's like, like people reach out to me and they will ask me like, what can I do and how do I go? This is my budget limit. Then I can direct them to places where they would help people from the underprivileged communities as well. So
Okay.
these are all there for people to seek out.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Oh wow, we've been talking for 1 hour. I'm going to, I'm going to pick two questions.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. The first one, I think it's more of a question than I think it's more of a comment. We need to educate our society about narcissism. I think if we create awareness about narcissism, people will start to recognize emotional abuse better, be it in a
Yeah.
romantic relationship, parent relationship, or etc.
Yep. So I think with narcissists, a lot of I read this quote somewhere where for other mental health issues, other people, you need to seek counseling yourself to deal with it. But with people who are narcissistic, people around them needs help, needs that
Yeah,
emotional support, right?
correct,
Because
correct.
it's because they are very, it doesn't mean people who are narcissistic cannot seek out help. They can, and see how it's affecting their interpersonal relationships and
Mm,
do something about it. But a lot of times some abusers can make everything about themselves.
yeah,
So even narcissism, we cannot loosely use it because it's a personality disorder. It's something that you need somebody to diagnose, you need a professional to
yeah,
diagnose you as having this personality disorder. Because my problem with people just throwing that about is we do that for everything. When somebody likes to arrange things, we say, oh, you are OCD. If
mm,
somebody is sad, you're like, oh, you're depressed. But these are all clinical disorders that you need to, that particular person has to go through a proper diagnosis to get that. With,
mm,
of course, sometimes people with narcissistic personality disorder might not feel that they are entitled,
of
they
course,
might not feel they need to do this. Right? So
yeah,
if you feel you're dealing with somebody who's narcissistic, then you please go and talk to somebody, because you're not dealing with just a common person with common relationship issues. You might
yeah,
need specialized tools to help you deal with this and to see
yeah.
what you can do to keep sane if you choose to continue being in this
Mm,
relationship with this person.
okay. And next would be another question from Jane. She says, thanks for answering the previous question. Last one from her. What are some questions one can ask themselves to examine if they are emotionally abused? Emotionally abusive or emotionally abused, especially when some expression of abuse is so normalized in our culture.
Okay, so I think this is a very, like, it's a very general thing, right? It's very general. Like, what is abuse to one person might not be abuse to, like,
Mm,
some people, like, calling them fat, they're like, it doesn't matter, I don't care, but for other people it'll be like, oh, you're body shaming me, I feel really upset. So I think it's a very, very personal thing. So, and
mm,
nobody can judge what you are supposed to feel, whether you should feel bad or you should feel good. I don't think anybody has the right to do that. But
yep.
in order to recognize this, I think all of us need to build that self-awareness. Where is my boundaries? What is hurtful
Mm,
to me? What am I accepting within a relationship? What am I not accepting?
mm,
Do I have the avenue to communicate this to this person who's in a relationship with me, whether it's my
mm,
parent, whether it's my partner, whether it's whatever? And what happens if these boundaries are not respected? Am
mm,
I being further abused? Am I being further traumatized by this whole experience? Am I paying for calling out this behavior? So all of this can then give you clues onto
mm,
whether you are being abused and whether you're being abusive. Am I constantly saying these things to this person? Am I
mm,
constantly apologizing and doing the same thing? How is that
mm,
affecting my relationship? Could it be that I'm being abusive when I'm angry, or as
mm,
just a matter of, in my conversation, am I doing this? So
mm,
for both, whether you're the abuser or being abused, you need that level of self-awareness. So I
mm,
would often say, to go out, you need to go within first before you decide what to do. You need to really examine what's going on inside,
mm.
and then and then see what you can do about it.
Okay, I think that's a very nice way to conclude as well, because at the end of the day, it comes. I mean, it goes back to us, because like what you said, some people would be fine with self-depreciating jokes. It's fine if you want to call me fat. I know I'm fat, kind of thing.
Mm,
Some people don't like it.
mm,
So it comes to the fact that what you like and what you don't like, for you to set your own boundaries, and for people around you to respect your boundaries. If they really
yeah.
love you, they will respect your boundaries, and they're
Yes.
not going to say, "Oh, that person is fine when I called her fat. What's
Yeah.
wrong with me doing the same to you?"
Yes.
And the fact that they're asking that question already shows, or indicates that they don't really care about what you're feeling,
Yeah.
and they're just brushing off as
Yeah.
you being too sensitive.
Yep. That
Mm,
awareness is not there. That person and this person is not the same, and we're not designed to be the same. So what's
mm,
acceptable for that person might not be acceptable for you.
yeah.
And also, I think as bystanders, that's also very, very important. If you see this happening, it's
Mm,
not a family issue, it's not a personal issue. If you see somebody being abusive anyway, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, social, whatever it is, I think always speak up.
mm,
There's more to lose by not saying anything than actually saying something. Because a lot
yep.
of times it's survivors who come out of it by themselves, and then when they talk to their friends will be like, oh, you know what? Actually, we realized that he's or she is like this, but we didn't want to say anything because it's your personal issues. But I think there's
Right.
always a respectful way of saying things
Yes.
as people who are watching it, because
Mm-hmm.
that also gives you a sign. Like people are looking at it in this way. Like a lot of
Mm,
people are seeing this in this way. So
yep.
could there be truth in it?
Yes.
And you never know, that could be the trigger that
Mm.
will get the person who's in this scenario to actually
To seek help.
consider
Mm.
seeking help. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think that is a great way to end this episode. Thank you so much for spending an
Thank
hour
you.
with Shani. I
No
think this was
problem.
like double the time we took for the first episode.
Thank you so much.
But I learned so much, and I think it's great that you explained it succinctly and also in a very layman's term without
Mm,
using a lot of psychological terms, because sometimes when you find words like that and then when you find it online, like different articles would define it
yeah.
differently and very difficult, right? So it's so much
Yeah.
more easier to uh, learn it through day-to-day examples,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having
Have a
me.
good night.
You too.
Bye
Bye.
bye. Okay, so that's the end of the show, and I hope to see you guys next Friday. No, 2 weeks from now. Good night.